The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered behind the velvet ropes, cameras ready, waiting for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a United States Marine Corps sergeant on his first visit to London. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, and his eyes sharp from years of military training. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. He carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from facing real danger and emerging stronger. Today was supposed to be a peaceful day off during his brief leave in London. He had heard about the precision and discipline of the British Royal Guards and wanted to see them for himself. As the crowd thickened, Marcus found himself pressed closer to the front. He watched as the tall black gates opened and the Royal Guards began their march. Their red tunics gleamed in the sunlight, and their black bearskin hats stood tall and proud. Each step was measured, each movement calculated to perfection. Among these guards was James Wellington, a man who had dedicated 8 years of his life to protecting the royal family. James came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands War, and now James carried on the family tradition with honor. He had trained for months to earn his place among the Queen's Guard, mastering the art of standing motionless for hours while remaining completely alert. The ceremony began like any other day. The guards marched in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. Tourists snapped photos and whispered in excitement. Children pointed and asked their parents questions about the funny tall hats and the serious-looking soldiers. But something was different today. As James took his position at the palace entrance, his eyes swept across the crowd as they always did, checking for any signs of trouble. His training had taught him to notice everything. A person moving too quickly, someone acting nervous, anything out of place. That's when he saw Marcus. The American Marine stood out not because of his uniform, but because of the way he carried himself. James recognized another warrior when he saw one. Marcus wasn't taking pictures or chatting with friends. Instead, he was studying the guards with the same professional interest that James might study a foreign military unit. Their eyes met across the courtyard. In that moment, something electric passed between them. It wasn't hostility or challenge, but rather a deep recognition. Here were 2 men who had sworn oaths to serve and protect, who had trained their bodies and minds for war, who understood the weight of duty and honor. Marcus felt his spine straighten even more. He had faced enemy fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, but there was something about this British Guard's steady gaze that commanded respect. The man stood like a statue, but his eyes were alive with intelligence and strength. James, for his part, found himself impressed by the American's bearing. Even in civilian clothes, the Marine carried himself with unmistakable military precision. James had trained with American forces during joint exercises and knew their reputation for toughness and determination. The crowd around them seemed to fade away. Other tourists continued taking photos and chatting, but neither Marcus nor James noticed them anymore. They were locked in a silent conversation that only soldiers could understand. Minutes passed. James remained in his position, his face showing no emotion, his body perfectly still, but his eyes never left Marcus. It wasn't a staring contest or a challenge. It was something deeper, a mutual assessment between warriors. Marcus found himself studying every detail of the guard's appearance. The way his uniform was pressed to perfection, the precise angle of his hat, the steady rhythm of his breathing. This wasn't just ceremony and pageantry. This was a real soldier doing his job with complete professionalism. The other tourists began to notice something unusual was happening. Some pointed and whispered. A few raised their cameras, sensing that they were witnessing something special, though they couldn't quite understand what it was. An elderly British woman standing near Marcus leaned over and whispered, "That guard there, he's been looking this way for quite some time. Are you someone important, dear?" Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't break the moment. Something significant was happening, and he felt compelled to see it through. His military training told him to assess threats and opportunities, but this felt different. This felt like meeting a kindred spirit. James could feel the attention of the crowd shifting. He knew that his job required him to remain focused on his duties, but something about this American Marine had captured his interest completely. In 8 years of guard duty, he had never felt such a strong connection to someone in the crowd. The morning grew warmer, and still they maintained their silent exchange. Other guards rotated positions, but James remained steady. Marcus's feet began to ache from standing in one spot, but he didn't move. A tour guide approached Marcus's group and began explaining the history of the guards. "These men are not just ceremonial," she said loudly. "They are active soldiers who have served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones. Their discipline and training are second to none." Marcus already knew this, but hearing it confirmed made him respect the guard even more. He could see the truth of it in the man's eyes. This wasn't someone playing dress-up for tourists. This was a real warrior standing watch over his nation's most important symbols. As the ceremony continued around them, Marcus and James remained focused on each other. The silent exchange was becoming something legendary, though neither man realized it yet. Tourists were beginning to point specifically at them, sensing the tension and respect flowing between the two soldiers. What had started as a routine day for both men was transforming into something neither had expected. A Marine and a Royal Guard, representatives of two proud military traditions, had found themselves in a moment that transcended words, nationality, and ceremony. The foundation was being laid for something that would be remembered long after the crowds went home. The silent standoff had been going on for nearly an hour when other people began to take serious notice. What started as casual curiosity from a few tourists had grown into something much bigger. Word was spreading through the crowd like wildfire about the American soldier and the British Guard, who seemed to be having some kind of intense, wordless conversation. Sarah Mitchell, a young journalist from the London Telegraph, was covering the daily guard ceremony for a light weekend feature story. She had done this assignment dozens of times before and expected nothing more than the usual parade of tourists and traditional military pageantry. But as she surveyed the scene through her camera lens, she noticed something extraordinary happening. "My God," she whispered to her photographer. "Are you seeing this?" Through her telephoto lens, Sarah could see the incredible intensity in both men's faces. The Marine stood rock still, his attention completely focused on the guard. The guard, despite being on duty and supposed to be watching for threats, seemed equally captivated by the American soldier. "Get closer," Sarah told her photographer. "I think we're witnessing something special here." Meanwhile, Marcus was beginning to understand that this moment had taken on a life of its own. He could hear whispers around him in multiple languages. Someone behind him was speaking rapid French, and he caught the word incroyable. Incredible. A group of Japanese tourists had their phones out, recording everything. But Marcus couldn't break away. Something about this British Guard commanded his absolute respect. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered anyone who projected such quiet strength and professional dignity. The man hadn't moved a muscle in over an hour, yet his eyes remained sharp and alert. James was experiencing something similar. His training had prepared him for many situations: hostile crowds, potential security threats, extreme weather conditions. But nothing had prepared him for this moment of pure recognition between warriors. The American Marine represented everything James respected about military service: dedication, courage, and unwavering commitment to duty. The crowd was growing larger by the minute. Word had somehow spread beyond the immediate area, and people were walking over from other parts of the palace grounds to see what was happening. Someone had posted about it on social media, and the post was being shared rapidly. A video blogger named Tommy Chen, who specialized in unusual London events, arrived with his camera crew. "This is absolutely mental," he said to his camera. "I've been covering London street life for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like this." These two soldiers have been staring at each other for over an hour now, and neither one is backing down. The atmosphere around Marcus and James was becoming electric. People were placing bets on who would look away first. Some thought it was a challenge or competition. Others sensed something deeper, a profound moment of mutual respect between two professional warriors. An elderly veteran in the crowd understood what was really happening. George Patterson had served in the Royal Navy for 30 years and recognized the look in both men's eyes. "It's not about winning or losing," he explained to anyone who would listen. "They're acknowledging each other, soldier to soldier. It's beautiful, really." Marcus became aware that he was sweating, not from the sun but from the intensity of the moment. His legs were beginning to cramp from standing in the same position for so long, but he refused to show any weakness. This had become about more than just two people looking at each other. It had become a representation of military excellence and mutual respect. James was facing his own physical challenges. His training had taught him to stand motionless for hours, but this was different. The emotional intensity of the situation was more demanding than any physical endurance test he had ever faced. Every fiber of his being wanted to acknowledge the American Marine properly, but his duty required him to remain in position. The other Royal Guards began to notice what was happening. During their brief rotations, they would glance over at James and the crowd that had gathered around his position. Some were concerned that he was being distracted from his duties. Others were impressed by his unwavering focus and discipline. Sergeant Major William Hayes, the senior guard on duty that day, had been watching the situation develop with growing interest. Hayes was a 30-year veteran who had seen everything during his career. He understood immediately what was happening between the American Marine and his guard. Magnificent, Hayes murmured to himself. Absolutely magnificent. The crowd had grown to nearly 300 people. Tour buses were stopping specifically to see the spectacle. Street vendors moved closer, sensing an opportunity to sell souvenirs and snacks to the growing audience. A small child tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked, "Mommy, why are those men looking at each other like that?" Her mother, struggling to understand it herself, replied, "I think they're showing respect for each other, sweetheart. They're both soldiers, and soldiers understand things about each other that the rest of us don't." The child nodded solemnly, somehow grasping the importance of what she was witnessing. Marcus could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, but it didn't matter. This moment had transcended the crowd, the cameras, and the growing spectacle. This was about something pure and fundamental, the bond between warriors who had dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves. James felt the same way. The growing crowd, the whispers, the cameras, none of it mattered. What mattered was this connection with a fellow soldier, this wordless communication that spoke to the deepest values of military service. As the second hour approached, neither man showed any sign of breaking. If anything, their resolve seemed to be strengthening. The initial curiosity had transformed into something approaching awe. People in the crowd were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, a moment of pure respect and recognition between two warriors from different nations but united by common values. The stage was set for something that would be talked about for years to come. By the third hour, the situation had escalated far beyond anything anyone could have predicted. News crews from 3 different television stations had arrived on the scene. The hashtag Marine V's Guard was trending on social media platforms across the globe. People were live streaming the event on their phones, and viewers from around the world were tuning in to watch this unprecedented display of military discipline and mutual respect. Marcus had entered a state of mind he recognized from his most challenging military operations. His body was present and enduring, but his consciousness had shifted to a place of pure focus and determination. The crowd, the noise, the cameras, everything had faded into background static. Only the British Guard existed in his awareness now. His military training had taught him about the power of mental discipline, but this was testing every limit he had ever discovered about himself. His feet were numb, his back ached, and his mouth was dry, but none of that mattered. This had become about something much larger than physical comfort or personal convenience. James was experiencing a similar transformation. In his 8 years as a Royal Guard, he had learned to disconnect his mind from physical discomfort during long ceremonial duties. But this was different. This required not just physical endurance, but emotional and mental strength of a kind he had never needed before. The weight of representing not just himself but his entire unit. His country's military tradition and the honor of the Royal Guard had settled on his shoulders. Yet somehow, instead of feeling burdened, he felt elevated. This American Marine was bringing out the very best in him, challenging him to demonstrate the highest standards of military excellence. Commander Patricia Reynolds from the British Army's Public Relations Department had been called to the scene to assess the situation. She had dealt with many unusual incidents during her career, but nothing quite like this. As she studied both men through her binoculars, she found herself deeply moved by what she was witnessing. "This isn't a publicity stunt or some kind of challenge," she reported to her superiors. "This is 2 professional soldiers showing the highest form of mutual respect. They're not competing against each other, they're honoring each other." The crowd had taken on a reverent quality. People were speaking in hushed tones as if they were in a cathedral rather than on a busy London street. Children who had been restless and noisy earlier were now sitting quietly, somehow sensing the gravity of the moment. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a military psychologist who happened to be in London for a conference, had joined the crowd after hearing about the event. She watched with professional fascination as both men demonstrated extraordinary levels of mental discipline and emotional control. "What we're seeing here," she explained to a reporter, "is a perfect example of the warrior ethos in action. These men have transcended individual competition and moved into a realm of shared excellence. They're not trying to defeat each other. They're inspiring each other to reach the highest possible standards." Marcus became aware that his perception of time had changed. Minutes felt like hours, but somehow hours also felt like minutes. He existed in a bubble of pure intention and focus. Every breath was deliberate, every heartbeat was conscious. He had achieved a state of being that he had only experienced once before, during a particularly dangerous mission in Afghanistan when his absolute focus had saved his entire squad. The British Guard's eyes had become his anchor point, his reference for everything that was honorable and excellent about military service. In those steady, intelligent eyes, Marcus saw reflection of his own commitment, his own willingness to sacrifice comfort and convenience for duty and honor. James was discovering reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. The American Marine's unwavering attention was like a spotlight, illuminating every aspect of his training and character. He felt as if he was being seen and understood at the deepest possible level by someone who truly comprehended the weight of military responsibility. The international media attention was becoming overwhelming. News outlets from America, Europe, Asia, and Australia were covering the story. Military personnel from bases around the world were watching the live streams, many of them gathering in groups to witness this extraordinary display of professional discipline. Colonel Robert Kim, a U.S. Army officer stationed in Germany, was watching the coverage with his staff. "That Marine is representing all of us out there," he told his officers. "Every branch, every service member. Look at the way he's conducting himself. That's what military bearing looks like." Similar conversations were happening in military installations across the British Isles. The Royal Guard was being seen as a symbol of everything that was excellent about British military tradition. The crowd had developed its own informal organization. Someone had started collecting donations for military charities. Others were handing out water bottles and energy bars to people who had been standing for hours. A group of British veterans had formed an honor guard of sorts around the perimeter, helping to maintain order and respect. As the afternoon wore on, both Marcus and James had moved beyond the realm of normal human endurance into something approaching the mythical. They had become living symbols of military excellence, representatives of values that transcended nationality, branch of service, or individual identity. Neither man was consciously thinking about the crowd anymore, or the cameras or the global attention their silent exchange was receiving. They existed in a pure state of warrior consciousness, each drawing strength and inspiration from the other's unwavering commitment to excellence. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, but neither Marcus nor James showed any sign of fatigue or wavering. If anything, they seemed to be growing stronger as the hours passed, as if their mutual respect was generating an energy that sustained them both. What had begun as a chance encounter between two soldiers had evolved into something that was touching hearts and minds around the world, demonstrating the power of honor, discipline, and mutual respect to transcend all boundaries. As the fourth hour approached, something unexpected began to happen. The crowd, which had grown to nearly 1,000 people, started to organize itself into something resembling a military formation. Veterans in the audience took it upon themselves to create orderly lines and maintain respectful silence. The atmosphere had transformed from curiosity and entertainment into something approaching a sacred ceremony. Marcus felt a profound shift in his awareness. What had begun as a moment of recognition between two soldiers had evolved into something much larger. He could sense the energy of the crowd, their respect and admiration flowing toward both him and the British Guard. But more importantly, he could feel a deep spiritual connection forming with his silent counterpart. In the Marine Corps, Marcus had learned about the concept of brotherhood, the unbreakable bond between warriors who had faced danger together. But this was something different. This was brotherhood being forged not through shared combat, but through shared excellence, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment to the highest standards of military conduct. James was experiencing his own transformation. In all his years of guard duty, he had been trained to remain alert and professional while essentially ignoring the crowd. Today, however, he felt connected not just to the American Marine, but to everyone present. The silent exchange had become a focal point for something powerful and meaningful about military service and human dignity. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Bradford, a British Army officer who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, arrived at the scene after receiving multiple calls from her colleagues. As she assessed the situation, she found herself deeply moved by what she was witnessing. "This isn't about nationalism or competition," she observed to the BBC reporter interviewing her. "This is about the universal values that all good soldiers share: courage, integrity, selfless service, and respect for others who have made the same sacrifices." The international response was becoming extraordinary. Military leaders from NATO countries were issuing statements of support and admiration. The President of the United States had been briefed on the situation, and the British Prime Minister was reportedly following the events closely. General Michael Harrison, the highest-ranking U.S. Marine in Europe, had flown to London specifically to witness the event. As he stood in the crowd, he felt a deep pride in the Marine who was representing their service with such distinction. "That young man is demonstrating everything we try to teach about Marine Corps values," he said to his aide. "He's showing the world what honor looks like." On the British side, Field Marshal Sir David Robertson had arrived to observe the situation personally. As one of the most senior officers in the British Army, he was deeply impressed by the conduct of both soldiers. "These men are writing history," he told his staff. "They're showing that military excellence transcends all boundaries. This will be remembered and studied for generations." Marcus was beginning to understand that this moment had taken on a significance far beyond anything he could have imagined. He could feel the weight of representing not just himself, not just the Marine Corps, but all American military personnel. The responsibility was enormous, but somehow it felt natural and right. His training had taught him that a Marine is always representing the Corps, whether in uniform or not, whether on duty or off. Today, that principle was being tested in the most public way possible. Every moment of his endurance, every second of his unwavering focus, was being broadcast around the world as an example of American military character. James felt the same weight of representation. He was not just a guard protecting the palace, he was embodying everything that was best about British military tradition. Centuries of history, countless acts of courage and sacrifice by his predecessors, all seemed to be flowing through him in this moment. The crowd had developed its own rhythm and energy. People were arriving with flowers, which they placed in neat arrangements around the perimeter. Veterans were sharing stories with each other about their own military service. Children were sitting quietly with their parents, somehow understanding that they were witnessing something important and historic. Dr. James Morrison, a historian specializing in military culture, had joined the crowd and was taking detailed notes. "What we're seeing here," he explained to anyone who would listen, "is a perfect example of how military values can inspire and unite people across all boundaries. These two men are creating a moment of pure human connection." The physical challenges both men were facing had become secondary to the spiritual and emotional power of their exchange. Marcus had long since stopped feeling the pain in his feet and legs. His entire being was focused on maintaining this connection with the British Guard, this wordless conversation about duty, honor, and mutual respect. James had entered a state of consciousness he had never experienced before. The American Marine's unwavering attention was like a mirror, reflecting back to him everything he aspired to be as a soldier and as a man. The exchange was no longer about endurance or discipline. It had become about excellence as a way of being. As word spread through social media and news outlets, military personnel around the world were gathering to watch the live streams. Barracks, mess halls, and command centers on 6 continents had become viewing parties where soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were witnessing this extraordinary display of military professionalism. In Afghanistan, a unit of British soldiers gathered around a laptop in their forward operating base to watch their colleagues' demonstration of unwavering discipline. In Japan, American Marines stopped their training exercise to witness their fellow Marines' representation of core values. In Australia, soldiers and Marines from both countries watched together, united in their admiration for what they were seeing. The fourth hour was drawing to a close, but neither Marcus nor James showed any sign of wavering. If anything, they seemed to be drawing strength from each other and from the incredible outpouring of respect and support surrounding them. What had begun as a chance encounter was becoming a global symbol of military excellence and international friendship, touching hearts and minds in ways that no diplomatic ceremony or official event could ever achieve. As the fifth hour began, something truly remarkable happened. Word had reached the highest levels of both governments, and officials were scrambling to understand and respond to this unprecedented situation. The silent standoff between Marcus and James had transcended military protocol and entered the realm of international diplomacy and global inspiration. The U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, Catherine Williams, arrived at Buckingham Palace accompanied by her military attaché. She had been in urgent consultations with Washington about how to handle this situation, which was being watched by millions of people around the world. This young Marine has inadvertently created the most powerful display of American military values I've ever witnessed, she confided to her staff. He's doing more for international relations right now than months of formal negotiations could accomplish. On the British side, senior palace officials were in deep discussions about protocol. Never in the history of the Royal Guard had a situation like this occurred. The Guard was technically on duty and required to maintain his position, but the extraordinary circumstances were testing the boundaries of normal procedure. Lord Chamberlain Sir Andrew Parker, the senior official responsible for the royal household, arrived to assess the situation personally. As he observed both men through the palace windows, he found himself profoundly moved by their demonstration of military excellence. This is exactly the kind of mutual respect and professional admiration that makes the special relationship between our countries so strong, he observed to his staff. These men are living symbols of our shared values. Marcus had entered a state of consciousness that felt almost transcendent. The physical world around him, the crowd, the palace, even his own body, had become secondary to the pure connection he felt with the British Guard. This was no longer about two individuals. It had become about the universal brotherhood of warriors and the power of mutual respect to bridge any divide. His mind wandered briefly to his fellow Marines serving around the world. He thought about his unit back in North Carolina, his brothers who had served with him in Afghanistan, and all the Marines who had come before him. In this moment, he felt connected to all of them, carrying forward a tradition of excellence that stretched back to the founding of the Corps. James was experiencing his own profound transformation. The American Marines' unwavering attention had become like a beacon, illuminating everything that was noble and worthy about military service. He felt the presence of all the guardsmen who had stood in this same spot before him, and all those who would stand here after him. The crowd had taken on an almost religious quality. People were speaking in whispers as if they were in a cathedral. Veterans were standing at attention when they thought no one was looking. Children were asking their parents serious questions about courage and honor. Major Patricia Kelly, a U.S. Army chaplain who happened to be visiting London, had joined the crowd and was deeply moved by what she was witnessing. This is a perfect example of how military service can be a form of spiritual practice, she explained to a reporter. These men have transcended individual ego and become channels for something much larger than themselves. The international military community was responding with unprecedented unity and support. Joint statements were being issued by NATO commanders, praising both men for their extraordinary demonstration of military professionalism. Military academies around the world were using the live stream as a teaching tool about leadership and character. General Sir Patrick Sanders, the Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, had arrived at the palace and was observing the situation with deep admiration. This guardsman is representing not just his regiment, not just the British Army, but the finest traditions of military service worldwide, he told the assembled media. The physical challenges both men were facing had become almost irrelevant. Marcus had discovered reserves of strength he never knew existed. His body had adapted to the sustained effort, finding a rhythm and balance that allowed him to continue indefinitely. The British Guard's steady presence had become his anchor, his reference point for everything that was excellent about military conduct. James had achieved a similar state of transcendence. The American Marine's respect and attention was like fuel, energizing him and enabling him to reach levels of discipline and endurance that went far beyond his normal training. This was no longer about following orders or completing a duty shift. This had become about demonstrating the absolute pinnacle of what a soldier could achieve. The crowd had organized itself into a remarkable display of international unity. American tourists were standing shoulder to shoulder with British citizens. Veterans from multiple countries were sharing stories and forming friendships. The respect and admiration for both men had created a bond among the spectators that transcended nationality, background, and personal differences. Dr. Michael Harrison, a professor of international relations at Oxford University, had arrived to study the phenomenon as it was happening. "What we're witnessing here," he told the BBC, "is the power of individual excellence to inspire collective unity. These two men are demonstrating that shared values are stronger than any differences between nations or cultures." As the fifth hour drew to a close, both Marcus and James seemed to be gaining strength rather than losing it. The connection between them had become so powerful that each was drawing energy from the other's commitment and excellence. They had created a positive feedback loop of mutual inspiration that was sustaining them, both at levels that seemed almost superhuman. The global audience watching the live streams had grown to tens of millions. Military bases around the world had declared unofficial viewing times. Families were gathering around televisions and computers to witness this extraordinary demonstration of human dignity and military excellence. What had begun as a chance encounter between two soldiers had evolved into one of the most powerful displays of international friendship and military professionalism in modern history, touching hearts and minds across the globe in ways that would be remembered for generations. As the sixth hour began, an extraordinary decision was made at the highest levels of both governments. The situation had become so significant that normal protocol was being set aside in favor of honoring what both nations recognized as a truly historic moment of military excellence and international friendship. The President of the United States called the British Prime Minister directly. Their conversation was brief but profound. Both leaders agreed that what was happening at Buckingham Palace represented the very best of the special relationship between their countries and should be allowed to continue to its natural conclusion, whatever that might be. "These two young men are doing more for international relations than an entire embassy staff could accomplish in a year," the president told his advisors. "We need to support them and honor what they're achieving." The Prime Minister expressed similar sentiments to her cabinet. "This guardsman and this Marine are showing the world what our countries stand for at their finest. They have our complete support." Marcus had reached a state of being that he would later struggle to describe. Every cell in his body seemed to be aligned with a single purpose: maintaining this connection with the British Guard and representing the absolute best of American military values. He felt as if he was channeling the spirit of every Marine who had ever served with honor and distinction. The crowd's energy was feeding into his strength. He could feel the respect and admiration of thousands of people, their silent prayers and good wishes flowing toward both him and the Guard. This had become bigger than any individual achievement. It had become a symbol of human excellence and international unity. James was experiencing his own transcendent state. The American Marine's unwavering respect had unlocked something deep within him, a reservoir of strength and purpose that he never knew existed. He felt connected not just to his own military tradition, but to the universal brotherhood of all who had sworn to serve something greater than themselves. The international response had reached unprecedented levels. Military leaders from countries around the world were issuing statements of support and admiration. The Secretary General of NATO had called for both men to be recognized for their extraordinary demonstration of alliance values. The crowd at Buckingham Palace had grown to nearly 5,000 people, but the atmosphere remained respectful and reverent. Veterans were conducting informal honor ceremonies. Children were receiving impromptu lessons about courage and integrity from their parents and grandparents. Royal Marine Commandant General Gwyn Jenkins had arrived to witness the event personally. As he watched the guardsman's unwavering discipline, he felt a deep pride in British military tradition. This young man is demonstrating everything we teach about military bearing and professional excellence, he told the assembled media. Colonel Maria Rodriguez, the senior U.S. Marine Corps representative in Europe, had flown to London specifically to support Marcus. As she watched him maintain his extraordinary focus and discipline, she felt overwhelmed with pride for the Corps and for the individual Marine who was representing them with such distinction. He's showing the world what it means to be a Marine, she said with tears in her eyes. Semper Fidelis has never been demonstrated more powerfully than this. The physical aspect of their endurance had become almost secondary to the spiritual and emotional dimensions of their exchange. Both men had transcended normal human limitations through the power of their mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Marcus was no longer conscious of time passing in any normal sense. Minutes and hours had become meaningless concepts. He existed in a pure state of focused intention, his entire being aligned with honoring the British Guard and representing American military values with absolute integrity. James had achieved a similar state of timeless focus. The American Marine's attention had become like a sacred flame that he was tending, maintaining perfect discipline and bearing in response to the respect he was receiving. The global audience watching the live streams had reached unprecedented numbers. Military academies around the world had suspended normal classes to allow cadets and students to witness this extraordinary display of military professionalism. The footage was being studied and analyzed by military historians and psychologists. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in human performance and endurance, had been called in to observe and comment on what both men were achieving. What we're seeing here goes far beyond normal physical or mental endurance, she explained to the media. They've entered a state of shared excellence that's sustaining them both at levels that should be impossible. The crowd had developed its own informal traditions. Veterans were sharing military challenge coins and placing them in a growing collection at the base of the palace fence. People were writing messages of support and admiration on pieces of paper and adding them to a growing memorial wall. A group of military chaplains from various denominations had arrived and were conducting quiet prayer services for both men, asking for their continued strength and safety. The spiritual dimension of what was happening was becoming as important as the military and diplomatic aspects. As the 6th hour drew to a close, neither Marcus nor James showed any sign of fatigue or wavering. Their connection had become so powerful that each seemed to be drawing unlimited energy from the other's commitment and excellence. The sun was beginning to set over London, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard, but the energy of the crowd remained as strong as ever. This was no longer just about two soldiers maintaining a silent exchange. It had become a global celebration of military excellence, international friendship, and the power of human dignity to transcend all boundaries. Military personnel around the world were gathering in unprecedented numbers to watch and support their colleagues. The brotherhood of warriors had never been demonstrated more powerfully than in this moment of pure mutual respect and shared excellence. As the 7th hour approached, something beautiful and unexpected began to unfold. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, creating a magnificent backdrop for what everyone present understood was approaching the climax of this extraordinary event. Marcus felt a profound sense of completion beginning to settle over him. The connection he had forged with the British Guard had accomplished something that went far beyond what either of them could have imagined when their eyes first met that morning. They had created a moment of pure human excellence that had touched hearts and minds around the world. James experienced a similar sense of approaching fulfillment. The American Marine's unwavering respect had brought out the absolute best in him, pushing him to demonstrate levels of discipline and professional bearing that exceeded anything he had achieved in his 8 years of service. The crowd of nearly 10,000 people seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, but also peaceful and reverent. This had become more than entertainment or spectacle. It had become a sacred moment of human connection and shared values. At exactly 6:01 p.m., as the palace clock tower chimed the hour, something remarkable occurred. Without any apparent signal or communication, both Marcus and James simultaneously began to move. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and perfectly synchronized, as if they had rehearsed this moment for years. Marcus brought his right hand up in a crisp military salute, his eyes never leaving the guard's face. The movement was precise and powerful, conveying 7 hours' worth of respect, admiration, and brotherhood in a single gesture. At the exact same moment, James returned the salute with equal precision and dignity. For the first time in 7 hours, his stoic expression softened slightly, revealing just a hint of the profound emotion and mutual respect that had been building between them throughout the day. The crowd erupted in the most respectful and moving ovation anyone present had ever witnessed. 10,000 people cheered, cried, and applauded as these two warriors acknowledged each other with the highest form of military respect. Veterans in the crowd came to attention and saluted. Children clapped with wonder and joy. The sound echoed off the palace walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of London. The moment lasted exactly 30 seconds, long enough for every person present and every viewer around the world to understand that they had witnessed something truly historic. Then, with the same precise timing that had marked their entire exchange, both men slowly lowered their salutes. Marcus took one step backward, then another, never breaking eye contact until he had reached the edge of the crowd. Only then did he allow himself to look around and truly see what had grown up around them during their hours of silent communication. James remained in position for another few minutes, his duty requiring him to maintain his post until the formal change of guard. But his eyes followed the American Marine as he made his way through the crowd, which parted respectfully to allow him passage. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. Both men were surrounded by reporters, officials, and well-wishers, all wanting to understand what had just happened and what it meant to them personally. Marcus, still somewhat stunned by the magnitude of what they had accomplished, spoke quietly to the first reporter who reached him. It wasn't about competition or proving anything, he said. It was about recognizing excellence in another person and honoring the values we both serve. That guard is one of the finest soldiers I've ever encountered. When James was finally relieved from his post, he was equally gracious and humble. The American Marine demonstrated everything I respect about military service, he told the BBC. His dedication and professionalism inspired me to be better than I thought I could be. It was an honor to share that moment with him. The international response was immediate and unprecedented. Both governments issued joint statements praising the two men for their extraordinary demonstration of military excellence and international friendship. Military leaders around the world called for both Marcus and James to be recognized with the highest honors their respective services could bestow. The footage of their final salute became one of the most viewed and shared videos in internet history. Military academies incorporated it into their leadership training programs. It was studied by psychologists, historians, and diplomats as a perfect example of how individual excellence could create moments of profound international significance. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from military personnel around the world. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from dozens of countries posted their own tributes, sharing how the display had inspired them to recommit to their own standards of excellence and professional conduct. Marcus and James met privately later that evening, away from the cameras and crowds. Their conversation was brief but profound. They exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. They had become brothers in a way that transcended nationality or branch of service. "Thank you," Marcus said simply as they shook hands. "No, thank you," James replied. "You brought out the best in me today." Years later, both men would look back on those 7 hours as the defining moment of their military careers. Marcus would go on to become a sergeant major, known throughout the Marine Corps for his unwavering standards and inspirational leadership. James would rise to the rank of company sergeant major in the Guards, carrying forward the lessons he learned about excellence and mutual respect. The story of the Marine and the Royal Guard became legendary in military circles around the world. It was told in barracks, mess halls, and training facilities as an example of what could be achieved when military personnel committed themselves to the highest possible standards of professional conduct. But the true legacy of that day was not in the fame or recognition that followed. It was in the thousands of military personnel who were inspired to be better, to strive for excellence, and to remember that mutual respect and professional dignity could bridge any divide and create moments of profound human connection. The silent showdown that shocked the audience had become something much more important, a demonstration that the values of military service, when lived with complete integrity, had the power to touch hearts, change lives, and bring people together across all boundaries of nationality, culture, and background. It had become a perfect example of how individual excellence, when shared with respect and humility, could create moments of beauty and meaning that would be remembered long after the crowds went home and the cameras stopped rolling.